Welcome to The Joe Cohen Show. Join me as I share my experience with biohacking and invite top health experts to explore the latest technology, supplements, research, and resources for optimizing your body and brain. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to bring on Dr. Elizma, who is a naturopathic practitioner, educator, and author with over 20 years of experience in functional medicine, with special interests in functional diagnostics, nutrigenomics, and cellular dysfunction. She's internationally recognized for her holistic approach to health. She links the elements of biochemistry, genetic symptoms to address complex health conditions by optimizing the body and mind to heal. She's regarded as an authority in functional test analysis, particularly in interpreting the organic acid test, which is one of the reasons I have brought her on. This is functional health testing is one of my current interests, and I want to see what can we learn from it, what's legitimate, what's not. She's the co-author of books Leaky Gut, Leaky Cells, Leaky Brain, and Dirty Genes. Excited to bring her on, and this is a interesting fact you might have not known. She's one of the slowest aging people that I've ever seen.
Thanks, Joe.
And thanks for coming on.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, so let's get started with the organic acids test, if we will. I'm trying to understand, I've looked into certain functional health tests, and it seems to be that some of them are not very legitimate, and some of them have something to them, right? So I want to disentangle what's legitimate, what's not. And even in this organic acids test, you have a lot of stuff, and it's not clear what is actionable, what's relevant, and what's not.
Yeah.
So we have here, we're going to be going through, if somebody's watching on YouTube, you could look at some things here on a screen share, but we're going through or an organic acids test, and we want to see how can we use this to understand what's going on, right? So I guess we're starting here with the yeast and fungal markers.
That's correct. Yeah. So we could start with the fungal markers, and the names always look very scary because it's like metabolites from biochemical actions, but they can actually give us a lot of information, some information direct and some more indirect from happening in other areas of the body. And you're absolutely right, Joe. Like some of the markers are a lot more relevant than others. There's some of the markers here that I hardly ever see abnormal, and then others that I see abnormal quite often. There's some markers where I do question how relevant they are. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of testing. Some markers are more relevant than others.
Okay.
Yeah. So we could certainly start with these markers.
Sure. Let's back up a little bit, and I want to understand. First of all, this is a urine test where most of these organic acids tests are urine tests, right?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, the first question I would have is in regular testing, you have this concept of false positives and false negatives. What's the rate of false positives? What's the rate of false negatives? The question then becomes, okay, so if we're looking at yeast and fungal markers, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the rate of, I guess they're not tied to any specific outcomes, right? And therefore we can't really know a false positive and a false negative, because it's not like we have these yeast markers and then you do a test, gold standard test to check for fungal infection, and we could see, okay, this is how many people were positive and negative, right? It's more just going down to the basic biochemistry and then trying to do some kind of differential diagnosis from there without really having any concrete yes or no's. Would you say that's correct?
I'd say that's correct. And I guess for that reason, I'm also a big believer that this is what I tell practitioners when I do lectures is like, if you listen to your clients, they will tell you the diagnosis. So I'm a very big believer in signs and symptoms. So any test, which includes the organic acid test, it's just really to maybe confirm or give you a little bit more information. But the signs and the symptoms are the most important. So if they have signs and symptoms of, let's say, Candida overgrowth, and it matches on the test, then great. But if they have signs and symptoms of, let's say, Candida overgrowth, and it doesn't show up on the test, I would still go more with the signs and symptoms. Like we have to remember, we're not treating numbers on a piece of paper. We're treating people. You've got to take all your information like together and then decide, okay, what's the best course of action to get that person the results that they want. And there's lots of things that can provide false positives and false negatives in the organic acid test. So you got to take those things into account.
So let's dig into that a little bit. What are the signs and symptoms of Candida, for example?
Very common ones would be like white coating on the tongue or oral thrush. Sugar cravings is a big one. Say also things like a lot of the histamine or aldehyde type symptoms. So that'll be things like brain fog, feeling like as if you've got a hangover, but you haven't had any alcohol. So it's headaches, brain fog, fatigue, all of those kinds of things. Typically with kids, if they have Candida overgrowth, they'll act very silly. So they'll roll around on the carpet, laugh at inappropriate stuff. They'll have very silly type of behavior. Bloating is very typical. So I'd say those are probably very common ones that I can think of. Sometimes also fungal rashes, athlete's foot, things like that can sometimes also be indicative of systemic Candida overgrowth.
Okay. Now, just to be clear, I want to just to set the tone a little bit. I'm going to be coming at this from a skeptical person. So
Mhm.
I don't want you to think that I'm challenging you or I'm trying to be, it's just my style is I like to get down to the nitty gritty details. And you definitely seem like somebody who's, can take the punches and whatnot. Right. But I'm not, I'm definitely just trying to get to the truth here. Right. So it's just want to be clear about that. Like I'm gonna try digging and into each of these things and try to really understand things on a deeper level. So let's see, we mentioned some symptoms, right? So the athlete's foot, I could see that's very clear because it means if they have athlete's foot, that's a fungal infection. If they're likely have one fungal infection, they're susceptible to other fungal infections. And that's something I can definitely see. The other ones are a little generic, except for maybe a hangover type feeling. What is that from? Is that from like Candida creating some sugar alcohols or something like that?
Yeah, Candida is it can certainly stimulate histamine release. It's a big, like there's a lot of organisms that can stimulate histamine release, right? So Candida is not the only one. But Candida tends to also trigger aldehyde release as well. And so aldehydes are like or acid aldehyde at least is like the compound in alcohol that gives us the hangover feelings when we have alcohol. There's a lot of symptoms that can mimic alcohol consumption or even like with aldehydes being used in a lot of chemicals responsible for strong chemical smells like perfumes and petrol and all of that. A lot of people can start developing, if it's quite severe, also chemical sensitivities. But that's really at the very severe end of the spectrum. Most people with Candida overgrowth, it's usually quite mild because Candida, we all have it, but it's an opportunistic organism. So if your immune system is suppressed because let's say you're stressed or you've been on antibiotic therapies or things like that, then it'll tend to overgrow. I guess a really classic sign would be the sugar cravings because Candida thrives on sugar.
I feel like if you ask people if they have sugar cravings, anybody who eats a modern Western diet is going to say yes, they have sugar cravings. And let's say, okay, Candida, that makes sense that they consume sugar, but how would Candida consuming sugar create sugar cravings? What would be the mechanism there?
Okay. So first of all, if someone is consuming a lot of sugar, I can almost 100% guarantee they will have Candida overgrowth. So I sometimes describe Candida as a little bit like body snatchers. And a lot of organisms work like that, not just Candida, but they will make you crave what they thrive on. They want you to eat what they thrive on. So they will, and a lot of people do get sugar cravings, don't get me wrong, but I'm talking about really uncontrollable sugar cravings, right? It's almost
But
like
that comes
Candida
from the brain
overload.
sugar cravings.
From the brain sugar cravings.
Yeah, the brain is the place where sugar cravings start from. Like there's different neurochemistry and neural circuits that are involved with cravings in general, right? It's
Absolutely,
related to
like
the
the dopamine
hypothalamus.
circuit.
Yeah, in the
Yeah.
hypothalamus, and there's a bunch of aspects there that are related to cravings. Now, I understand that Candida may cause some of those things, like for example, maybe it increases histamine, which then increases cravings, or right, something to that effect. The idea is, but I guess I'm curious, what is there a mechanism by, because it's not just Candida like sugar, so it sends a message in the post office to the brain to consume more sugar. There's probably there's some mechanism there where something's happening in the brain that's causing somebody to eat more sugar.
Yeah,
Or
look, so there could be a variety of reasons, right? And I'm not going to say that I know the exact reason, but we know that Candida is a huge producer of interleukin 6, which is an inflammatory cytokine. Interleukin 6 can disrupt hypothalamic pituitary axis and cause dysregulation in certain areas of the brain, inflammation, if you wish. And we know that inflammation in the brain can also then dysregulate a lot of other neurotransmitters like dopamine. Although dopamine is not really necessarily, it's not as strongly related to sugar specific. Normally, dopamine is more related to more like bulimia type eating disorders where it's not sugar specific. Normally, sugar specific cravings are more to do with, I believe, the opioid system, if I remember correctly. But I'd say you're right. I don't think that's everything is necessarily directly Candida makes you crave sugar because it thrives on it or it feeds on it. There'll be other ways it's doing it as well. It will disrupt neurochemistry in the brain, create inflammation. One of the things that Candida, for instance, will do as well is that it would upregulate anaerobic metabolism. And anaerobic metabolism is essentially, if you look at it from a mitochondrial perspective, is not it's not the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, right? Because that's where we need oxygen. It would be more glycolysis where we don't need oxygen. So what will happen a lot with, let me just go here. So here, for instance, we have the glycolysis markers, right? Lactic acid, pyruvate, and then we have 24 to 29, which is more like the Krebs cycle markers. So what can happen with chronic Candida infection is you'll find that these markers, 22, 23, more than 22 will become upregulated, right? So it's like the body gets stuck in glycolysis instead of nice, proper mitochondrial energy production. So Candida can do that. And I guess in that sense, glycolysis that's where sugar metabolism takes place. In the mitochondria is like where we can break down glucose, we can break down amino acids, and we can use ketones for energy production in the mitochondria, the TCA cycle. Whereas if it's only sugar, then it all gets stuck in glycolysis. So I guess we could argue Candida by upregulating anaerobic glycolysis, that in itself also increases the demand for glucose. I guess that could be another kind of like mechanism.
okay, interesting. And yeah, so the other symptoms besides hangover, I wonder, is there any way to check these aldehydes in the blood directly? Because that seems like something that's more specific versus other conditions where, bloating could be pretty much any condition, sugar cravings. If I look at the list that you gave me, I would say the ones that would make sense for me more that are specific would be thrush and athlete's foot, because that means somebody their immunity is not working very well and they're susceptible to fungal infections. But things like headaches, fatigue, brain fog,
Mm,
bloating, and sugar cravings, that could be from anything.
I
Could
agree.
be from any number of things.
Yeah, I agree. They're quite generic like symptoms, and absolutely they can be like related to a number of things. In terms of aldehydes, as far as I'm aware, I don't believe you can measure for aldehyde in the bloodstream. You can measure for Candida antibodies, but again, it doesn't mean that you're going to have antibodies if you've got Candida, but you can measure for Candida antibodies. I don't find stool testing very accurate for Candida. For that reason, I probably would say that's not as accurate. But for me, the organic acid test is probably one of the more accurate tests for Candida overgrowth. And that's more specific because of the tartaric and arabinose markers. They are quite specific for Candida in itself. And the reason why I guess I don't like stool testing is because Candida is they're colony-forming organisms. And so it really depends on where you take the sample, on a stool sample, whether you're going to find Candida on a stool test or not. I tend to not rely so much on stool tests for Candida overgrowth, but a lot more on the organic acid test, and pretty much based on the tartaric and arabinose markers there. But yeah, like in terms of blood tests, you can't really measure for aldehydes per se. I think you could certainly do your typical mast cell markers, your tryptase and your TGF-beta 1 to see if there's some kind of mast cell activation. But again, these two, like a Candida, is the only organism that will trigger mast cell activation. Pretty much any infection, bacterial or parasitic, would trigger mast cell activations.
The question is, how much are these fungal infections actually influencing the individual versus, meaning I think when I had a fungal infection, I don't think it was the root cause really of anything. I think the immunodeficiency was the root cause, and if you have immunodeficiency, then anything can happen from there, right? And then the skin fungus, the having a burping up like a smell of yeast after fluconazole, which is an antifungal. And then I'll look at people in acro yoga and I see, okay, they've got fungus on their feet, right? Like they don't necessarily have any of these issues that some people are referring to that have candida, but it's definitely clear that there's some immunodeficiency going on there, right? And there's an overgrowth of fungus. So I guess the question is, you don't really know if that's really causing the actual symptoms or if that's just a symptom itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. And a lot of people with Candida overgrowth, they don't really have any symptoms. And so it's not necessarily, like you said, the root cause. For instance, I'll give you an example. I see, let's say you had mold exposure, right? And there's all kinds of different types of mold biotoxins, and they all have slightly different consequences in the body. So, for instance, ochratoxin A it tends to target the kidneys a little bit more. And so, mycophenolic acid, which is a type of a mold biotoxin, it really suppresses the immune system, right? So, it's immunosuppressive. So, a lot of people with mycophenolic toxins, because of mold exposure, either past or present, they can end up with Candida overgrowth or Clostridia overgrowth or whatever other opportunistic organism. You're absolutely right. Candida may not be the root cause. It may be something like a mold exposure or stress. Chronic stress we know that's very typical for suppressing immune function as well. Nutritional deficiencies. We know that folate, for instance, is very important, especially methylated folate for our immune system, because we need folate for cells to divide. And if you have, let's say, a low white blood cell count or low neutrophils, often that can be a folate deficiency. You're right. Like sometimes there's other reasons for the candida, and candida in itself is not the root cause. It had to get the opportunity to overgrow and then become pathogenic. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes sense. I think that's what I see as well. What about, so when we're looking at these tests for candida, I guess my question or yeast and fungal markers, the question is, what percentage of people do you see are positive for these markers that come to you? Is it like 80%, 20%?
I'd say the arabinose marker, which is number 7, easily 80%. Some it's just marginally elevated by 1 or 2 points. And in those cases, I don't often really bother with it. And then you can sometimes see it in 100. So not every single marker that I see on a test result is necessarily actionable. In fact, I would say with the organic acid test, I may see 20 markers that's abnormal, and I might only focus on 5 markers. And in my experience, when we retest, let's say 4 or 6 months later, all of them have normalized. So often a lot of the markers on here are they will correct themselves if you work on the main things. Like I'll use the nutritional markers as an example. So often with the nutritional markers on the organic acid test, which is these guys here, where they test like for B12 and B6, I often will see deficiencies here, but I don't treat them. So I don't give someone a B2 supplement or a B6 supplement. I focus on the other things that I see there, whether it's toxicity issues or what have you. And then when we retest, all the nutritional markers have normalized because they're either burning through a lot of nutrients because of whatever is going on in their biochemistry, or they're not absorbing them because of gut issues. And so I'd like to work on the main issues, and then all of the other things could sort themselves out like along the way. But in terms of the candida, yeah, look, I probably see it in about 80% of people. But for some, it's mild and you don't worry about it. And for others, it looks like it could be more problematic.
So what percentage of the people do you think that candida is like a root cause for the people?
We use the word root cause more in the sense of where it can be really problematic and produce symptoms. then I'd
Yeah.
probably say from the people where I see those markers elevated, maybe 60% of them, it can be quite problematic. And in the other 40, it's not, in my opinion, worth like focusing attention on, because I think there's bigger fish to fry, so to speak.
Okay. And so let's get to, now that we're on the yeast and fungal bandwagon a little bit, let's get to mold. I can tell you what my experience with from mold, seeing people that had mold issues has been. And what I would say is that a lot of people with mold issues that I've seen in the past, I believe that it's legitimate. They have some, there was some inflammatory event that occurred. I don't think we can ever really figure out exactly what, even if we show elevated levels of mold or whatever, right? And some people maybe they're it's like they know they get exposed to mold and there's a very clear symptoms and then they go away from it, it goes away. One thing I noticed is the level, there's a lot of mental health issues from all the people that I've seen with mold issues. And I'll give a little bit of my own story where I did a megadosing experiment about a few months ago, where I took massive doses of AKG and proline. These were different megadosing experiments. These turned into glutamate. It made me understand, I did this many times, these experiments. It made me understand that, and what happened was I had a leak in my apartment, which there was also visible signs of mold. And I started to get certain symptoms that people with mold claim to have. And what I realized is, wait a second, maybe this is from the high levels of AKG or glutamate in the brain, because it's like, yeah, when you have high levels of glutamate, it could cause a nocebo effect. And so I said, let me just, it seems like I'm reacting to it, but let me actually just try to bring down glutamate. When I brought down glutamate, those symptoms went away. And now I basically just stopped taking, like I reduced the dosage to normal quantities of AKG, and basically those symptoms went away, even though the mold was still there for 2 months. So I'm not saying people are making this stuff up. Mold can be harmful, and I don't think there's any question there. I guess what I've seen with a lot of mold patients is that their nervous system is very overactive. And there were multiple times where I noticed that these people are in a very clean environment and they're still reacting to mold. And there were certain situations where years later they found things like certain anti-stress methods help them or whatever. So I guess my question is, like, how do you diagnose these mold cases, right? I feel like there's confounding variables, which makes it difficult to understand. Okay, is this mold or is this high levels of glutamate that is causing a nocebo effect?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And so I'm going to come from a few different angles for that one. So if we look at mold, and I know that with mold, a lot of people will refer to mold issues as part of the SIRS picture, which is the chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is essentially inflammation in the brain, right? And so if we go and look at that, and if we focus on the inflammation in the brain aspect, we know that there's a histamine component to that, right? So histamine in the brain can come from histaminergic neurons, which is actually very important for learning and cognitive function. But histamine from mast cells in the brain would be linked to more an immune or an inflammatory response. So what happens in the brain is when we have a mast cell response and lots of histamine release in the brain, then that histamine can then bind to astrocytes in the brain, and it specifically binds to H1 or receptors, or histamine 1 receptors on the astrocytes. That's what histamine does. And then the astrocytes will release a huge amount of glutamate. There's actually a very strong association I find, between brain histamine and brain glutamate. And I think you're right in that sense, is that, yeah, we can't say it's the mold producing the symptoms. It's the changes that mold is creating in the biochemistry that's producing the symptoms. And that can be through that histamine glutamate kind of way. It can also be through the basal ganglia pathway. So mold biotoxins tend to seemingly affect the basal ganglia of the brain, which is where dopamine regulation takes place. And so as soon as you have basal ganglia dysfunction, you can get a whole variety of symptoms, which probably a lot of people with mold do experience. such as addictive behavior, OCD type behavior, tics, tremors, a lot of
Those
symptoms
are all
that's all.
glutamate. Those are all glutamate type disorders.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. So there's like this, that's why it's more complex than that. And I know that you, within your line of, with your interests, I know you get that it's more complex than just saying it's the mold biotoxins doing this. It's more like, what are they dysregulating? What areas of the biochemistry are they dysregulating? And that will determine the symptoms. And we all have different genetics. So you can have 10 people with mold biotoxins, and they may not necessarily have exactly the same symptoms, right? Because I don't know, one person may have a very oversensitive histamine 1 receptor genes, and another person not oversensitive histamine 1 receptor genes. And that's why you have to look at people very, at least how I look at it is you have to treat them as individuals. So I don't really have protocols for things. I like each person is like a whole brand new case, and you have to tease out what's more important for them, where are the blocks in their biochemistry, why are they experiencing the symptoms that they are experiencing. So it is definitely not as simple as, yeah, as what we want it to be.
Yeah, I guess I like everything that you're saying. I think you make a lot of sense, and I think it's important. You know, this is why testing is important. I also think it's important that when you have certain conditions, like any autoimmune condition, really, you have people saying SIRS, this, that. They're trying to give things a name that don't really have a name. I've done a lot of research on this SIRS thing, and there's two ways to look at it. One is it's complete bullshit. One is there's some elements to it that are legit. And I'll explain why those both could be true. Because when I look at people, I look at their biomarkers. There's nobody that has everyone's elevated on all these exact biomarkers. And even if they are, it doesn't tell you what the underlying cause is. That's the problem, is you cannot necessarily look at these inflammatory biomarkers and say it's from this, right? And so
Yeah.
you start saying, some people say, oh, it's Lyme disease. Oh, it's mold. Oh, it's this. Dr. Gundry is going to say it's lectins, right? Because everybody with that he sees, if they take away lectins, these issues go away. And the answer is that for me, for example, it wasn't biotoxins, it wasn't infections. If I were to see any of these functional, not any, but most of these functional medicine doctors, they would have just told me Lyme, mold, this, that, and the other. Actually, for me, it was food sensitivities. And what I found was that when I fixed those food sensitivities, number one, by taking away certain things, or more recently, I actually fixed my immune system. I recalibrated my immune system with various supplements. That fixed the issue. So I could eat dairy, I could eat a whole bunch more stuff. And I find that I'm just much more resilient to, if I'm exposed to mold, my body doesn't break down, or I could be exposed to infections or this. And so there's, in the past year, I've seen everybody just get like 10 infections, 12 infections. Every month, people had an infection this past year that was around me, and myself included. I just didn't end up getting sick from it. I just had the infection. I realized, okay, I'm a little weaker, whatever. The idea is that there's so many things in the environment, right? And they synergize together, that it's okay. Maybe you had a little bit of mold, and then you also had an infection combined with a predisposition for anxiety and high glutamate, right? And just came all together with stress. And so it's a little difficult to pinpoint, which is why I like what you're doing, is you're looking at testing, trying to understand. I think with testing, it allows you to pinpoint more things, even though you don't know what the cause is or the result, but if you could optimize these markers, you still will end up achieving a result.
Absolutely. I'd probably say, even though I see very complex cases, and you're right, they've got all these labels, mast cell activation syndrome, and all these kinds of things. I would probably say, because I'm a big believer in timelines, I love timelines. It's like, when did you start getting symptoms? When did you get sick, right? And I'd say 90% of people, it started with a stressful event. Yeah, I think we
I have
completely
the same experience, by the way. The same
yeah,
exact experience with the
yeah,
clients that I've helped in the past.
we completely underestimate how much stress can shift our biochemistry and then make us susceptible to other things. And then once you get those other things, they in themselves start a cascade, right? So even if we take mold, for instance, I know there's a research paper on ochratoxin A. I'm assuming it's going to be for all mold biotoxins, but I can't say this for sure. I know that there's a paper on ochratoxin A, mold biotoxin. where it essentially it stops your glutathione system from becoming activated, right? So whenever we have oxidative stress, our glutathione system becomes activated through the NRF2 mechanism. And then the body makes more glutathione, and then we detox whatever we're supposed to detox. But if you have ochratoxin A, and let's say you have also your diet isn't that great, because there's a lot of the antioxidant fluids that will stimulate that NRF2 mechanism. So let's say you're not getting a lot of those foods in, you get exposed to mold biotoxin. And now those mold biotoxins will inhibit your glutathione system from becoming activated. Now you get exposed to heavy metal and your body can't detox it. So now you get heavy metal issues, right? Or whatever other toxicity issue. So that's what happens to people. They end up with all of these things gone wrong. They don't understand where to start to get it fixed, but you can sort of work it backward. And often you'll find that it has these very simple beginnings, but because every time something gets added on, they end up with this complex biochemical mess, and it just becomes harder to treat or harder to figure out where to start with them.
Yeah, and one thing I realized recently is that with these stressful events, like you said, I think one of the things that occurs now is actually a micro trauma. People don't realize this, right? They think that they got some mold in their system, right? And again, I'm not belittling mold or whatever it is, some Lyme or whatever. I think often it's trauma that changes the brain neurochemistry in a very significant way, because people are just like, I never had anxiety before. All of a sudden I got it. Did it happen after a very stressful event? Yes, it did. Right? I'm
Mm.
like, okay, the brain can have some pretty significant changes from trauma, and people, they tend to think, okay, I've got a parasite infection. I just got to get rid of this and then it's done. Or I've
Yeah,
got this mold, or I've got this candida. And that very well could be true. They might have certain things. And I think either way, you want to get rid of that stuff to optimize your body. And if you have those things, it means your body's not optimal. But you also have to recognize, and I think you do recognize this, that there's people who are just exposed to mold and exposed to everything, and they're resilient. It just doesn't affect them, right? And you want to be that kind of person, that was like a shift in my thinking with health, where, in the first phase of my health, I made a huge change, but it was by taking things away. And a couple of years ago, I realized, okay, while I'm quite healthy, healthier than the vast majority of people, I'm not resilient, right? And I then started to say, okay, I want to be the most resilient person around. And that's when things went from, like, my goal was to become the healthiest person, not just, okay, I'm functioning well because I took away certain foods. It was more like, okay, now I'm very resilient. Okay, I'm exposed to mold. I'll try to get out of it, but it's fine. I should be able to withstand, just like if you're exposed to an infection, if you're exposed to any number of viruses or whatever. Honestly, same with a vaccine. People are like, oh, this vaccine killed me, this, that. You should be, there's millions of people who got the vaccine and didn't have any side effect. The idea is that I believe that you should be, what our goal should be in health is making the body resilient so that no matter what happened, you are fine, right? You're exposed to heavy metals. Okay. You want to make your body resilient so that you're fine.
absolutely. I agree with you. And I don't think there's one answer to that. You could look at it from the perspective of tolerance versus intolerance in the gut, which is a lot to do with histamine and interleukin 10 and a whole bunch of other cytokines. But then you can also look at that from a perspective of mitochondrial fitness. The more mitochondrially fit you are, the more resilient you'll be. And you could even go down to the hygiene hypothesis, where we've got all of these allergic children because they didn't play in the soil and ate germs and stuff like that. I remember, like, I can't remember if I read it or watched something on it, but there was something about they found tribes. So like tribes in Africa, tribes in Southern America, who haven't really been exposed to modern day living and all of that. And they found like that these people had huge amounts of parasites, gut parasites and all kinds of stuff, but yet they weren't sick, right? And they were like, if the modern person had those parasites, they would be really unwell. And it was just, we adapt to our environment kind of thing. And I absolutely agree with you that it's not about avoiding things. It is about making yourself resilient. And you're right, like some people get exposed to heavy, like huge amounts of heavy metals because maybe of the industries that they work in, but they don't end up with any health issues. Whereas other people, it's just that they can just be exposed to a small amount and it makes them incredibly sick. And maybe that's why I enjoy reading or listening to some of the experiments that you do, because I know that you're very much into, I don't know if you call it biohacking or if what the term it is that you use for it, but I think it is something we have to challenge our bodies to become stronger and more resilient and be able to tolerate more things, because this is the world we live in. We can't not get exposed to these things. So
Yeah, and I don't know if I would call it here. Yeah, maybe you could call it biohacking, optimization. One of the things I noticed is you can't always tell how optimal you are. It's not clear to the individual how optimal they are, because if you don't have a problem, you just deem optimal for your own
mm,
narrow point of view, right? If you have a problem, you just say, "Oh, I can't focus," but that's not really a problem until you actually fix it. So it's hard to know what's optimal until you fix it. That's what I found. I thought I was optimal. Maybe, yeah, I want to improve my focus. And then until you actually improve something, you're like, okay, maybe now I'm more optimal. And you don't know what your limit is until you actually improve. What helped me a lot is actually optimizing all of my lab markers in an optimal range. So if something's not in an optimal range, you don't know if it's exactly causing or an association with something else. But as I optimized all of my biomarkers, I just found my body was getting more and more resilient, which is why I like the approach that you're doing. You're saying, look, if we can optimize certain things, the whole thing is going to be optimized and somebody's going to become more resilient no matter what their problem is exactly. Even if they have some candida, if it's the root cause or not, if we do a couple things here, we can optimize a bunch of other biomarkers and the person's going to feel much better. So I really like that approach.
yeah, and I agree with you. And I guess that's where markers can be useful, because at least it gives us a starting point, right? Because without that, we don't really have a starting point. And I like how you say about optimal markers, because you can have markers in the normal range, but they're not optimal, right? So even I look at low normals, high normals, and that's still significant. That's still a pattern. We still should, I guess, pay attention to those things. So yeah, and I absolutely agree with you on that. And yeah, we don't really know how good we can be until we are where we are, or we experiment and we see where we're at. Like I know for me, I used to be an elite athlete, and I think in my 30s, I was probably the healthiest I was ever in my entire life. And I felt amazing. I was on keto. I was doing keto diet, running like,
Wait, you're not in your
3 hours
30s
a day.
now?
Say again?
You're
No,
not in your
I'm not.
30s now?
I'm not Joe, but I will keep it to myself how old I really am.
Okay.
But
No?
yeah, I just remember there was a stage, like I was like a machine. For me, I know keto is not for everyone, but for me, keto worked really well to a certain point. And the amount of energy I had and the brain clarity I had was just, yeah, I felt completely unstoppable. And that for me was probably where I would say I was the most optimal I ever was in my entire life. And you don't know it until you get to that point. And it's, oh my gosh, I actually can think sharper and all of that stuff. But when I was a teenager, I wouldn't have thought that I could be better or healthier. But there you go.
And do you
Then
still do keto or not really?
I do a form of it, not as strict as I used to. I'm now a lot getting more into the gut microbiome. So I think another aspect of optimization is microbial diversity. I see a lot of people with very low microbial diversity for very different reasons. And it was very interesting because I do a lot of microbial testing. I'm geeking out on the individual gut microbes and what they do and what feeds them and what suppresses them and all of that. Because I don't know, I find this stuff very interesting. And the interesting thing to me was I see hundreds of these tests, and I obviously look at people's diets. And it was like, oh, okay. So people who follow more, I don't want to say extreme diets, but polarized diets. So let's say a vegan diet or a carnivore diet, they seem to have lower microbial diversity because you're cutting out food groups, right? And I was very surprised that like it's actually because I used to be very anti grains. And surprise, what I'm seeing is the people who eat more grains actually have got a much higher microbial diversity. So I'm like rethinking stance on that a little bit. And it's, oh, okay. So grains are not the evil necessarily that maybe it's been made out to be. And
By the
seems
way,
to
that's
have,
for the listeners, that's a very good sign that somebody's credible if they're if they're changing their opinion. If
yeah,
you
you're
hear somebody that doesn't change their opinion, run. Somebody
absolutely,
got stable opinions for 20 years, you gotta run.
absolutely. I 100% agree with you. I always want to learn more. And if once you stop learning, you're useless. You gotta keep learning. And so that was for me a bit of a surprise. And so I try and incorporate more foods now for good microbial diversity and all of that. So yeah, no, definitely that would be one thing that I'll say. My clients are my biggest teachers through what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what improves on their test results, what doesn't. And then that's probably one of the reasons, even though I do a lot of research work for other companies, I don't think I'll ever give up clinical practice because that's where I learn the most. Research is research. It's great reading a research paper, but it's not always clinically relevant. It doesn't always work like that in the real world, what they say in a research paper.
67% of listeners aren't subscribed to the show, so please don't forget to show your support by hitting the subscribe button now. You'll not only be supporting the show, but also investing in yourself and your health journey, all while helping to keep us ad-free.